I am excited about talking with you today, President's Day, because as many of you know, I'm a great fan of Abraham Lincoln. As a child, I grew up in Illinois, the land of Lincoln, and in fact grew up in central Illinois, which is the area where Lincoln lived and practiced for so long. Like many school children, I made the pilgrimage, usually on a yearly basis, to Lincoln's home in Springfield, to his grave, and I journeyed the roads he traveled as a circuit-riding attorney. Carl Sandburg's trilogy on Lincoln was my inspiration to become a lawyer, and I even went so far later on in life as to marry a woman from Lexington, Kentucky. That's the extent of my obsession. Thankfully, we're much more happily married than old Abe and Mary Todd appeared to be, although, that's right, she's on the front row, although she still wonders why I get nervous when she wants to go out to the theater. For some years, I've been studying Lincoln closely and professionally, and I'm working on a book entitled The Lincoln Way, The Evolution of a Master of Conflict. For now, I want to share with you some insights that I've gained along the way about what Lincoln has to say to lawyers and how his words were reflected in his own practice. You know, just when you probably thought there was nothing more to say about Lincoln, we had something like 100,000 documents unearthed, and also something like 5,400 case files from Lincoln's legal practice. He practiced law for about 23 years. He was still handling cases during his first year or two as president in the middle of the Civil War, if you can imagine. So we have today a wave of new scholarship that's really looking at some things that haven't been looked at so closely before, particularly Lincoln's earlier years and his law practice. What you'll see is attitudes and practices that are reflective of a legal community of which he was a part, but in some respects also reveals the extraordinary character of this great American, one who actually believed he was called to do great things. See if I can figure out the technology here. Lincoln's legal career subsumed the entire spectrum of law practice, from the humdrum of frontier circuit courts to the role of lawyer's lawyer before his state's highest tribunal. Lincoln saw regional practice evolve rapidly as the state moved from unrefined frontier to a settled, burgeoning economy. Over a quarter century, from the early 1830s to 1861, he handled everything from matters to repossess a pig to capital cases, both as defense counsel and as a prosecutor, to major railroad litigation. Among the latter was Hurd et al. Versus Rock Island Bridge Company. This is better known as the F.E. Afton case. It was a very famous case of its day. It involved the collision between a riverboat and a bridge, which was, of course, a railroad bridge and belonged to the railroad company. So it pitted the interests of two major transportation interests, the railroads and steamboat companies, against each other. Lincoln appeared, as he often did, on behalf of the railroad company. Now, in 1860, some months before he was nominated for president as the candidate of the Republican Party, Lincoln turned down an opportunity to become the general counsel of the New York Central Railroad, one of the nation's leading corporations, at, I should mention, a salary of $10,000 a year, which was worth a great deal more than it is now. Today we will focus on some of the principles that animated Lincoln's law practice, using examples gleaned from his own files. And you'll see facsimiles of a lot of documents from those files. We'll also draw occasional parallels and supplementary examples from the time when, as Chief of State, he led the country through its ultimate defining crisis. Lincoln's Lesson 1. Use litigation as a last resort. Be frank with your client about the costs and risks. Avoid irrational optimism. In a lecture to lawyers in the early 1850s, Lincoln said, "Discourage litigation. Persuade your neighbors to compromise whenever you can. Point out to them the nominal winner is often a real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. They were, after all men back then. There will still be business enough. Now, although Lincoln wrote these notes for a law lecture, there's no doubt they were a touchstone of his own practice. A veteran of many years of rough-and-tumble advocacy around Illinois' 8th Judicial Circuit, Lincoln could be a formidable opponent in the courtroom. Besides having his way with a jury, he was comfortable wielding all procedural arguments or technical devices that might avail a client of victory or postpone or ameliorate defeat. Here's a picture of Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon. Herndon insisted Lincoln was even better in a set-piece battle before appellate judges, where his intense emphasis on preparation and well-developed logic came to the fore. And yet, time and time again, Lincoln discouraged clients from pursuing litigation or strongly cautioned them about the costs and risks of vouchsafing their case to a judge or a jury. Take, for example, a letter written to a would-be suitor late in Lincoln's law practice. This is 1859. Yours of February 28, 1859 is received. I do not think there is the least use of doing any more with the lawsuit. I do not only not think you are sure to gain it, but I do think you are sure to lose it. Therefore, the sooner it ends, the better. Lincoln to Hayden Keeling. Now, Herndon and other Lincoln friends remarked upon Lincoln's propensity for seeking a settlement in lieu of court. Former law clerk John Littlefield remembered him. Wouldn't you have liked to have been, by the way, one of Lincoln's law clerks? Remembered him telling would-be clients again and again, "You have no case, you better settle." Now, one who espoused such great faith in the power of reason and logic, and himself exhibited great precision of mind, must have keenly discerned the limitations of legal process. You had crowded circuit court dockets, with court sessions in most counties limited to no more than a few days a year. You had difficulties procuring evidence and witnesses. You had the unpredictability of local tribunals and juries. And finally, the difficulty, often the insurmountable difficulty, of executing on a debt in the face of a determined, recalcitrant debtor. Here's a declaration in the case of Canaan versus Kelly. This was one of those cases of Lincoln's that would drag on for years, with debts that remained unpaid long after a court's judgment. Then there was Mcdaniel versus Corral, which began with the dictation of a nuncupative will in 1853 and concluded after many continuances and several trials a full decade later. Now, this was in 1863. What's going on then? We're near the midpoint of the Civil War. Finally, Lincoln receives a message from his partner, William Herndon, saying the great Mcdaniel case had at last been won. Lasted longer than the Civil War. Lincoln was very aware in a personal way of the reputational cost of being sued. He experienced extreme indignation and anguish when two surviving partners of his father-in-law's business, Oldham and Hemingway, brought a cause of action against Lincoln for withholding monies due the partnership that he'd allegedly collected. In essence, they were charging Lincoln with fraud. Although the cause of action was later determined to be meritless, the bitter sting of the experience lingered long afterward. Lincoln lived in a society which depended less upon banks than upon personal credit, evidenced by promissory notes, and individuals were accustomed to functioning both as creditors and debtors. In times of economic downturn, and there were national panics in 1837 and in 1857, many a promissory note would remain unpaid by its due date. And for a variety of reasons, the most rational solution for a creditor was usually to make appropriate accommodations rather than seek foreclosure. Lincoln favored such adjustments whenever possible, perhaps calling to mind his own years of toil to repay the obligations of a failed business in New Salem, Illinois. He ruefully labeled that his national debt. In a letter to one Louisville wholesaler who'd retained him to collect debts from Central Illinois merchants, Lincoln explained, "You know, we've been receiving promises from time to time of the payment of those notes, but which payment has not yet been made. Unless payment is soon made, we shall commence suits, though this course we shall regret, for they are honest and honorable men, but they are hard-pressed." Not surprisingly, Lincoln reserved his greatest contempt for those who would stir up litigation. He said in his notes for a law lecture, "A worse man can scarcely be found than one who stirs up litigation. Who can be more nearly a fiend than he who habitually overhauls the register of deeds in search of defects in titles whereon to stir up strife and put money in his pocket? A moral tone ought to be infused into the profession, which should drive such men out of it." I should mention, by the way, that a good part of the reason why his family moved from Kentucky to Indiana in the first place was because of disputes over title in more than one piece of property. So I think Lincoln again was thinking personally about these issues. Lincoln's lesson 2. Try to be objective in assessing your client's case. Avoid irrational optimism. Now, part of my research on Lincoln is really looking at Lincoln through the filters of what we now know about conflict management. Modern research has demonstrated that when we're locked in conflict, reality is filtered through our own cognitive processing. Our personal filtering system can cause us to be less than objective about our conflict and surrounding circumstances, thus creating different kinds of negotiating traps as well as opportunities. Research has shown that many lawyers have a tendency to be overly optimistic about their chances in court, to overvalue their case. My negotiating students should remember that. Like the citizens of Lake Wobegon, we all believe that our children are above average. There's the commitment effect. Once we take a position, we feel pressure to behave consistently with that commitment and justify our earlier decision. We may be selective in the way we interpret the information we get afterwards, using some of it to reinforce our position or undermine an opposing position. Then there's reactive devaluation. If a proposal comes from the other party, then it's automatically suspect or devalued. Now, according to Herndon, Lincoln was not like that. Lincoln's perceptions were slow, cold, clear, and exact. He saw all things through a perfect mental lens. He was not impulsive, fanciful, or imaginative, but calm and precise. In short, this wasn't a man who would easily fall victim to false hopes or inflated expectations about the strength of a client's case or the chances of prevailing in court. Put another way, he would avoid that irrational optimism modern studies show so often tends to underpin lawyers' and clients' perceptions. Take the case of Chicago speculator Herring Chrisman. He saw a golden opportunity to buy state land at wetland prices. He perceived that a loophole in state statutes governing swampland would enable him to purchase thousands of acres of prime real estate, prime state property at a little over $1 an acre. Now, this was a steal even in 1856. Having heard of Lincoln's expertise in land deals, Chrisman and his colleagues sought him out and encouraged him to study the matter in detail. Lincoln told Chrisman to come back in 2 weeks, at which time he'd have an answer. 2 weeks later, Chrisman presented himself at Lincoln's law office. Lincoln looked up and said, "You can't do it." Chrisman was stunned, in part because experience taught him that pursuing the matter further would have garnered Lincoln a fat fee. Chrisman later recounted, "Who ever heard of an attorney refusing a fat case before? I could not have done that myself." He was even more surprised when Lincoln requested only $5 for his efforts. Lesson 3. Be clear about your client's interests and focus your energies accordingly. Lincoln was also adept at identifying a client's key interests, the needs and feelings and drives that lie beneath the surface of human interaction and that animate most legal disputes. In so doing, Lincoln was sometimes able to help formulate a novel solution that creatively addressed clients' real needs. A classic illustration involved causes of action for slander by, to use a common example, a woman accused of fornication or loose morals. Now, it's interesting that, back then, if you wanted to slander someone, you would accuse a woman of loose morals. You would accuse a man of business fraud or something like that. Isn't it interesting? Anyway, Lincoln and other lawyers of his time and place were well aware that the subject of such accusations was first and foremost socially stigmatized, and that no economic satisfaction in court was as important as the ultimate vindication, which was the clearing of their name. Only the latter would have a chance of permitting a woman or a man to once again effectively navigate in their social environment, restore damaged relationships, and heal emotional wounds. Take, for example, the case of Moran versus Baddeley. Here, Lincoln was among the lawyers in his community who used the mechanism of a consent judgment. Now, this was agreed to by both parties. This was a case involving a woman accused of some kind of moral turpitude, while the agreed judgment was for the full amount claimed by the victim of the alleged slander, sometimes thousands of dollars. Little or no money ever changed hands. Indeed, what they were after was really the publication of a formal acknowledgement that the speaker had wronged the claimant. And this was what they were really attempting to achieve. And it's probable that Lincoln's skills as a mediator, which we'll hear about later on, played a key role in resolving cases of this kind. Lesson 4. Give your priority immediate attention. Of course, a satisfactory understanding of pertinent facts and applicable law is normally a prerequisite to presenting an objective analysis. Lincoln appears to have been assiduous in addressing pending client issues. Here, he sounds a little bit like Poor Richard's Almanac and our friend Ben Franklin. He says, "Leave nothing for tomorrow which can be done today." In fact, the full quote is as follows: "The leading rule for the lawyer, as for a man of every other calling, is diligence. Leave nothing for tomorrow which can be done today. Whatever piece of business you have in hand, before stopping, do all the labor pertaining to it which can then be done. When you bring a common law suit, if you have the facts for doing so, write the declaration at once. If a law point be involved, examine the books, and note the authority you rely upon in the declaration itself, where you're sure to find it when wanted. The same of defenses and pleas." And he goes on. By his own lights, Lincoln was not a quick study. Indeed, it took a long time for him to absorb something, but he was capable of intense concentration on the subject at hand. Lincoln later brought the same skills and commitment to his role as commander-in-chief. Now, Lincoln did not often micromanage, but if you look closely at his career, you see he educated himself thoroughly on military strategy and tactics, ordnance, weaponry, personalities and capabilities of his generals as well as those of his opponents. He was a thorough study. Lesson 5. This may be my favorite. Focus on the crux of the case and earn points for conceding non-essential elements. Lincoln described himself as slow and methodical in analyzing a matter and honing legal strategies and arguments, but his care in preparation allowed him to reduce a matter to its core elements. He was a dedicated logician. He would often read Euclid's geometry when he was out on the road. Imagine Lincoln lying there with his bare feet dangling out over the end of a bed, which he was sharing with 1 or 2 other people, and reading by candlelight at 1 or 2 in the morning. But he systematically developed the chain of reason that would support his case or defeat an opponent's. He was rigorous in testing the legal viability and factual grounding of pleas. In court, Lincoln's ability to isolate the critical components of his case allowed him to concede the non-critical elements and thereby score points with a judge or a jury. And I can testify from personal experience that truly is important to a trier of fact. Let's hear from his friend, longtime friend, and co-practitioner Leonard Swett. Swett says, speaking of Lincoln, as he entered the trial where most lawyers object, he would say he reckoned It would be fair to let this in or that in, and sometimes when his adversary could not quite prove what Lincoln knew to be the truth, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to admit the truth to be so and so. And when he did object to the court, after he'd heard his objection answered, he would often say, well, I reckon I must be wrong. Now, about the time he'd practiced this through the case, if his adversary didn't understand him, he would wake up a few minutes later finding that he had feared the Greeks too late and woke up to find himself beat. He was as wise as a serpent in the trial of a cause. I have got too many scars, says Sweat, from his blows to certify that he was harmless as a dove. When the whole thing is unraveled, the adversary begins to see that what he was so blandly giving away was simply what he couldn't get and keep. In other words, by giving away 6 points and carrying the 7th, he carried his case. And the whole case hanging on the 7th, he traded away everything which would give him the least aid in carrying that. Any man who took Lincoln for a simple-minded man would very soon wake up with his back in a ditch. Lesson 6. Begin negotiating cooperatively and encourage the reliance of others by behaving in a logical and predictable way. Look for trade-offs. Sound familiar? In the frontier communities in which Lincoln practiced, a cooperative approach to negotiating legal disputes was facilitated by the bonds of familiarity. The uncertainties of negotiation were reduced because many of the lawyers negotiated with were very well known to him, even in the early days, to the point of, as I said, sharing beds while riding the circuit. Lincoln regularly served alongside an attorney in arguing a case, and the next day would appear against the same attorney. He also had occasion to appear for and against the same clients, including one of his main clients, the Illinois Central Railroad. In 1 or 2 cases, it appears, he even appeared for both sides at different times. Relational connections also reinforced the likelihood of a collaborative solution. Lincoln and his peers could avoid extreme positional bargaining and the posturing that goes with it. In some cases, personal familiarity with both parties allowed Lincoln to play the role of mediator, as reflected in the following message to a suitor client. I understand Mr. Hickox will go for the purpose of meeting you to settle the difficulty about the wheat. I sincerely hope you will settle it. I think you can, if you will, for I have always found Mr. Hickox a fair man in his dealings. If you will settle, I will charge nothing for what I have done, and thank you to boot. By settling, you will most likely get your money sooner and with much less time and trouble. Now, throughout his life, Lincoln held to the old maxim, a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. Lincoln understood the power of a meaningful trade-off, the quid pro quo in achieving a bargain. As a youthful member of the Illinois legislature, he was, after all, a legislator, he became adept at log rolling, the practice of obtaining another legislator's vote on a critical piece of legislation in exchange for something that they wanted. Lincoln's political acumen was demonstrated by his successful effort to transfer the state capital from Vandalia in southern Illinois to Springfield. The same skills were of great value in the negotiation of legal disputes where, to use Lincoln's metaphor, a stitch in time may save 9. Lincoln, the inveterate politician, must also have thought, you know, everybody in this legal process, friend, foe, witness, judge, or spectator, is a potential voter for me. So, as a politician, he was rigorously even-handed in his treatment of parties and counsel, regardless of their political affiliation. Of course, if a cooperative approach failed to produce a positive response, Lincoln was very capable of shifting tactics. As a competitive bargainer, he would be in a position to draw on his formidable trial advocacy and at the same time his innate objectivity, which would render him less susceptible to an opponent's efforts to manipulate or mislead him or his opponent. Lesson 7. Seek creative ways of bridging the gap to an agreement that achieves a client's key goals. Now, we talked earlier about the creative use of consent judgments to resolve slander cases. That was only one example of Lincoln's penchant for inventive methods for resolving disputes. Lincoln and other lawyers made regular resort to binding arbitration, consigning legal disputes to judgment by private persons outside the courts. Now, in a society where circuit courts met only a few days each year in a particular location, with long gaps between the sessions, arbitration was probably an appealing alternative. Sometimes the parties employed arbitration without agreeing to be bound by the result. They said, let's arbitrate and see what happens. In such cases involving non-binding arbitration, either party might end up refusing to abide by the award. And more than once, Lincoln was involved in challenges to arbitration awards. In addition to serving as an advocate in arbitration, Lincoln had actual experience as an arbitrator. In one matter involving a boundary dispute between adjoining property owners, Lincoln drew upon his earlier experience as a surveyor to render an arbitration award in the form of a drawing depicting the decreed boundary. Then there's Webster versus Angell. Here Lincoln had a tough client. A client who had what Lincoln considered was, shall we say, a less than stellar case. It involved the purchase and sale of land. Now, Lincoln persuaded the parties to engage in an abbreviated arbitration procedure. One might even call it what today we would refer to as a mini-trial. It was in a hotel room before the presiding circuit judge. It was the night before it was supposed to be tried in court. And he got the actual judge, his friend David Davis, to preside in this hotel room. Now, when the defendant, Dr. Angell, was unable to come up with the full down payment to pay Lincoln's client the amount that the judge said he should pay, Lincoln loaned this other person the balance, $16, in order to complete the transaction and resolve the case. Not surprisingly, Lincoln found himself playing the role of informal mediator. Here's another legal dispute, Gill and Rupert versus Webster. Here, negotiations had resolved all issues save for one. Lincoln and opposing counsel, who apparently had a good working relationship, bridged this final gap by getting the parties to agree the matter would be resolved by the attorneys themselves acting as referees. The final written settlement agreement incorporated the term reflecting the lawyers' mutual resolution. There's also evidence that Lincoln's penchant for direct communications, seeking out collaborative solutions, may have led to some frustration on his part in the 1850s. As there was a growth of multi-state corporate practice, much more long-distance communication, which made practice inherently less personal. But many of the key insights of his early days were carried forward into his presidency. Lesson 8. Understand and play to your audience to persuade and motivate. Invoke the power of narrative and, if appropriate, humor. In law as in politics, Lincoln's sense of his audience was often pitch perfect. Lincoln rightfully prided himself on his ability to communicate a case to a jury. He would tell Herndon, "If I can free this case from technicalities and get it properly swung to a jury, I'll win it." Lincoln's use of humor is, of course, legendary, and he used it effectively to underline key points and disarm opponents through his legal and political career. He usually made himself the butt of his stories, often deprecating his own looks. Speaking at a banquet held by anti-slavery editors in 1856, he apologized for being present. He explained that not being a newspaperman, he felt out of place. He told the story of an extremely ugly man who was riding along a narrow road. He was met by a woman. As she passed him, the woman looked at him intently and finally observed, "Well, I'm darned if you're not the ugliest man I ever saw." "Perhaps so," admitted the unfortunate fellow, somewhat crestfallen. "But I can't help that, madam." "No, I suppose not," agreed the woman, "but you might stay at home." During the early days of Lincoln's presidency, he was immediately confronted with the crisis of secession. And of course, we know that that whole crisis was focused on a fort in the harbor at Charleston, Fort Sumter. And as the game became deadly, Lincoln knew he needed widespread Northern and international support. He knew that the forces in Charleston, the Confederate forces surrounding the harbor, would fire if he sent in supply ships, and thus bear responsibility in many eyes for starting the Civil War. Therefore, Lincoln forced the South to act as the aggressor at Fort Sumter by openly informing the South he would be sending food, but not men or munitions, to Fort Sumter. Later on, in 1862, one of Lincoln's reasons for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation was because he understood that once the Union truly committed itself to emancipation, the masses in Europe, who regarded slavery as an evil demanding eradication, would not be easily maneuvered into supporting the South. Lesson 9. Do not place your own financial or personal interests above those of your client. Keep your ego and your temper in check. One of Lincoln's most extraordinary qualities was his ability to temper his own financial and emotional needs in the interests of fairness or effective service to his client. Although Lincoln believed in charging fair fees and would often ask a retainer before providing legal services, he professed that an exorbitant fee or retainer should never be claimed. His own rates tended to be sufficiently low that he was once brought before a kangaroo court, one of those nights after they'd completed real court proceedings. Now imagine yourself in a hotel room with this guy, Judge David Davis, who later was appointed by Lincoln to the U.S. Supreme Court. They held this kangaroo court, and Judge Davis fined Lincoln for taking too small fees. On occasion, Lincoln would also offer to relinquish all or part of his fee in order to bring about a settlement. But then there are cases like this. The Illinois Central Railroad versus McLean County and Park case. This shows that Lincoln did take the matter of fair payment seriously. This was one of the biggest pieces of litigation Lincoln was ever involved in. And at the end of it, after helping to win the case for the Illinois Central Railroad, the railroad balked at Lincoln's fee. So Lincoln sued the railroad for several $1,000s in fees, and he won. Oh, and by the way, Lincoln did get back that $16 he loaned to Dr. Angel in that other hotel room settlement. One of Lincoln's greatest attributes was his self-control. In 1863, as president, Lincoln wrote to admonish a young Union officer who was abusive of his peers. He said, "Quarrel not at all. No man resolved to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiation of his temper and loss of self-control. Yield larger things to which you can show no more than equal right, and yield lesser ones, though clearly your own. Better give your path to a dog than be bitten by him in contesting for the right. Even killing the dog would not cure the bite." His passions were tightly reined. You know, in my research, one watershed moment that I think I've unearthed in Lincoln's life was in making the decision to go forward with his marriage to Mary Todd. I don't have time to tell you all of the circumstances surrounding that, but initially he failed to show up on their wedding day. And a year later, after much struggle and a very bleak and black period of depression, Lincoln resolved to go forward with the relationship and, of course, proposed to her again, and they proceeded forward with marriage. Now, I believe Lincoln faced a situation in which he was himself a house divided. And he knew that it had to be all one thing or all the other, or he would not be able to go forward. So he believed that the course of honor and indeed friendship required him to honor his prior commitment to his friend Mary Todd. And they married. And while their marriage is noted for a lot of the problems that were associated with it, this marriage between these two remarkable people, nevertheless for Lincoln, I think it was an important Rubicon, because in crossing that bridge he established command over himself, and demonstrated the ability of sheer willpower. Lincoln's extraordinary self-discipline is also reflected in his efforts to control his own bouts of depression. Though his chronic depression was a matter of frequent comment by lawyer colleagues in Frontier, Illinois, he systematically searched for appropriate remedies, and he apparently did achieve a significant amount of success in a struggle that lasted until the very last day of his life. Equally remarkable was Lincoln's capacity to overlook slights and humiliations if the interests he was serving required it. Here's a document from the case of McCormick versus Manny. This truly was one of the most important cases that had ever come Lincoln's way. In 1854, he was retained in connection with a case of considerable national significance. Now, one of the parties is Cyrus McCormick, the designer and manufacturer of the Reaper, who sued John Manny for infringing one of the patents on that Reaper. Lincoln was retained by Manny's side, the defense. Lincoln engaged, as usual, in extensive study and analysis. Although the trial was originally supposed to be set in Chicago, one of the reasons why they retained Lincoln, it was moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. So he traveled to Cincinnati for the purpose of, he thought, meeting with the client and making final preparations for what promised to be the most important trial of his career. Well, when he arrived in Cincinnati, he was confronted by two other Eastern lawyers, both highly prominent and experienced in business litigation, who'd also been retained by McCormick. It quickly became clear they had their own ideas about how to conduct the case, and more than that, they regarded their Illinois colleague as an interloping ignoramus. The lawyers made a point of excluding Lincoln from their deliberations and even wouldn't eat with him. Later, when Lincoln tendered a carefully prepared memorandum that summarized his arguments for the defense, it was returned to him without being opened. Lincoln was relegated to the role of spectator at the trial. Despite his wounded feelings, he took the opportunity, characteristically, to watch and learn. Some years later, in the dark days of 1861, Lincoln realized that he and the country needed a highly intelligent, forthright, and well-organized individual to help supervise the Union's war effort. Despite all, he turned to none other than one of the lawyers who had treated him with such callous disrespect in the McCormick litigation. And Edwin M. Stanton became Lincoln's Secretary of War for the remainder of the Civil War. Lincoln, the most maligned and hated president in U.S. history, did not afford himself the luxury of retaliating in kind. As one author said, he did not mare down the names of those who'd not supported him, or nurse grudges, or hold resentments, or retaliate against enemies. Indeed, he tried not to have enemies, not, as he said, to plant thorns. Finally, Lesson 10. Be graceful under fire and magnanimous in victory as well as defeat. Ernest Hemingway defined courage as grace under pressure. Grace under pressure, moral courage, may have been Lincoln's greatest attribute, of immense value in leaders in legal as well as political arenas. For most of the war, the possibility of strategic defeat continued to stare Lincoln in the face, even until the fall of 1864, right before the election. The Northern public received regular bad news from the field as a succession of generals failed to bring to bay General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. As heartsick as Lincoln was, he never surrendered to the gloom of defeat. Also, following this, Lincoln wrote a letter to Mary Todd's cousin, who was a cadet at West Point, encouraging him to keep his spirits up. Even when Lincoln and his family received an incalculable blow with the death of their son, Willie, in early 1862. He was 11 years old at the time, and it was a very hard period in the war. Lincoln forced himself to carry on at the helm of the Union, a standard he would bear for 3 more years. Lincoln also forbore, importantly, from blaming others for setbacks, took the responsibility on his own shoulders. As one author said, President Lincoln never shunned any responsibility and often declared that he, and not his cabinet, was in fault for errors imputed to them, when others sometimes thought otherwise. Lincoln refused to let Stanton be blamed for the failings of the Army, insisted that all Stanton had done in regard to the Army had been authorized by him, the President. Finally, Lincoln was magnanimous in victory. He bore the mantle of the Union and its restoration as his central charge. His public pronouncements in the wake of major victories were always tempered by the awareness that today's foes were tomorrow's united brothers. His most memorable words, which all of you know, were not aimed at stoking passions, but intended as a soothing balm for a riven and wounded society, North and South. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all that may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. The society in which Abraham Lincoln practiced law, pervaded by a strong sense of community, reinforced and encouraged many of the traits and habits reflected in Lincoln's own law practice. Lincoln carried over many of the lessons of practice into his presidency. Although lawyers perform in many different settings, some of the central insights of Lincoln's practice, as well as his years in the presidency, remain of great value to us today. Thanks. Let me ask you if there are any questions that you have about anything we talked about or anything else about Abraham Lincoln. Jerry?
The one thing you write about helping scholarships finance.
That's good. Jerry Phillips just wrote a book on billing. And, you know, Lincoln, one might say, was somewhat unorthodox by our present standards of billing and accounting and looking after money. We might say that he was somewhat lackadaisical sometimes about the way they handle things. Of course, it was a small law office, and it was just him and his partners. But he would often, you know, jot down an IOU and give it to a partner, and he would come in with a wad of bills and split the money. You know, so it was very much more informal than we might think today, although I do know that his integrity was very important to him, and I think that there are, of course, stories that have been told about his honesty and his penchant for always trying to do the right thing. So while he may have seemed exceedingly informal in some ways about billing arrangements, nevertheless he was, you know, he certainly behaved with integrity. Other questions? Yeah, Z.
It's my recollection from reading something that in the 1850s or so, our law system was not adversarial the way it is now. Would you comment on that? I mean, was he really as much of an outlier then as he would be today? Or?
I think it's one of the things I want to try to emphasize is that Lincoln was not separate and apart from the community of which he was a part. And I hope from time to time I emphasize the fact that some of the techniques that he used and approaches like the consent judgment for slander, that was a recognized method for addressing issues. You know, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that they were a community and that these people all knew each other, they dealt with each other regularly, they were a network that was on some level inseparable. And so you recognize that you had to get along. You had to give and as well as take on a regular basis. And so I really believe that a local community-based law practice was really at the heart of that insight. I don't know that I can say that you know, overall what law practice in the United States looked like, but I would think that to a great extent that's what it looked like. And indeed, even during the course of Lincoln's career, by the end of it, it was beginning to be less community-oriented, much broader. He'd be much more likely to be dealing with someone, maybe a client, maybe an opposing party or an opposing lawyer in another state. And that's different you don't have the bonds of familiarity. You don't have the likelihood of dealing with one another the next day and or the next week. And so, yeah, I think that makes a huge difference. And today, you know, ironically, some of us are engaged in practices where they might be nationwide or even international in scope. But the irony comes from the fact that as a number of us who are engaged in different kinds of practices know, you do gradually get to know the people in your specialty. And so there is another kind of community that I think to some extent makes up for that loss of connection that we had on the local level. Other questions? Yeah. Karen.
You've obviously spent a lot of time with Mr. Lincoln. I'm interested, if you had the chance to have dinner with him, what would you ask him?
You know, I heard an interview with Doris Kearns Goodwin the other night, and that she was talking about that. She said she just liked to hear him crack jokes, tell stories, you know. That's a really good question. I think I would love to just hear him speak, and I think be a part of a general conversation with him, not necessarily talk great concepts, but learn more about him. I've always imagined Lincoln as sounding and looking a bit like a great uncle of mine, who frankly was not someone who had a mellifluous voice. You know, it was very much he was a Midwesterner, but with some Southeastern roots. And you could hear that in his voice, and he spoke with quite an accent. And I've often thought, and he looked a lot like Lincoln, very raw-boned and spare. And I would love to be able to sit and listen to him. You know, the thing that strikes me, as I think you can tell, the more I've looked at Lincoln, and particularly now that I'm getting more and more into his presidency and looking at how he struggled with those issues, and struggling with his own personal concerns. He really stacks up mightily as a human being. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, but he learned from his mistakes, and he never stopped trying. And he always tried not to be the problem, but to be part of the solution, which I think is really important. Eric?
Speaking of the presidency, did you see Steven Spielberg's movie?
I did see Lincoln. How many of you have seen Lincoln? I would expect this self-selected audience might be a little more interested than most. I thought it was a good film. I thought that, interestingly, the thing that I keep talking the most about is not Daniel Day-Lewis's remarkable performance, but I thought Sally Field really did a wonderful job of portraying the haunted Mary Todd. And, you know, I've often felt sorry for Mary Todd, because if she'd been a man, she would have had tremendous opportunities in the world, politically and in business. She would have probably been governor of Kentucky or a senator at least, and maybe gone for the presidency herself. Whether she would have made it, I don't know. But as a woman, she had to, really achieve her ambitions through another person. And so she chose Abraham Lincoln. And I think she did a pretty good job. But you know, they had their share of struggles. They really did, and she had a very sad life. And I think that comes through very dramatically in the film. It's not just, but it's Lincoln and all of his relationships. You really get a great view of his. He talks about his relations with his father, which were not great. You notice very intuitively you pick up on his not too great relationship with his older son, Robert, which was rather distant, and his much closer relationship with Tad, his remaining younger son. And you know, but all of these different relationships that he has are portrayed in the film, and I think in 2.5 or 3 hours, Tony Kushner did a terrific job of portraying that. Jerry?
What would Lincoln be today, a liberal or a Democrat or a Republican?
Lincoln, well, that's good. We do know that it's interesting that you ask that. You know, Lincoln was in favor of course, public improvements, which really was one of the main things to focus on as a Whig. He also tended to favor, as a president, we know, the power of the executive and the national power, and was opposed to slavery, although he was a moderate. You know, it's important to emphasize the fact that he was a moderate politician. He could not have succeeded as a full-blown abolitionist. And although he shared a lot with the border state politicians, he was not that either. He was, in many respects, kind of a middle-of-the-roader, and which is in short supply today. But when when the Civil War started, he basically came into it saying, my goal is to preserve the Union. I will do whatever I have to do to preserve it. He personally abhorred slavery. He hated it. He thought it was, you know, just a horrible, horrible blight on mankind. But at the same time, he didn't know how to resolve the issue. And he was talking about things like compensation to slave owners and gradual emancipation. The main thing he wanted to do as president was to limit the extension of slavery. Now, as time went on, he very rapidly altered his position as circumstances changed. So by about a year and a half into his presidency, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. That's not very far in. If you compare it, say, to Obama's presidency or anybody else's, I mean, he's moving very rapidly. And then by the beginning of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed, and by the end of his tenure, we had the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. So I'm not really answering your question. I will accept to say that he was a moderate. Certainly the political labels that applied then don't apply now. So the Republican Party of that time was focused on different things than the Republican Party today, as is the Democratic Party. But then, you know, everybody was consumed, no matter what their other politics. Everything else they could agree on. But slavery became the great dividing issue, and by the time Lincoln became president, they were sliding down into the abyss. It was unavoidable. And
strong federal government, wasn't he?
He was certainly in favor, I mean, as it turned out, very strong. His actions probably did as much to strengthen the hand of the federal government as any president. So, you know, you can draw conclusions from that. Again, I think he was looking at it pragmatically, but as opposed to strictly, you know, in terms of some grand political concept. I think he was trying to get a job done. So, one more question, then I think we need to wrap up. Yes?
What about your book? When is it going to be published?
When will it be published? I don't know, but I hope you'll buy it whenever it is. I don't know. I have, as many of you know, I have a lot of things I'm working on. So I usually end up having to write articles about arbitration and stuff like that. But this is and I'm actually working on another research project, which you'll see some results of this year. It's actor-studio disputes. And I've had a chance to interview a famous actress, Olivia de Havilland, and Gloria Stewart, and some others. But I'm actually writing an article right now about Olivia de Havilland and Warner Brothers and their landmark case. But really looking at the whole relationship and how, you know, the different dynamics of that, and how Olivia and other actors dealt with studios and vice versa. So again, it will be focused on conflict resolution. But the Lincoln thing is a great love, and so I intend to try to produce that. I'm shooting for sometime probably in late 2014 or 2015. But as soon as possible. Okay. Thanks again, everybody. Thank you for coming.